All right. Let's forget this thing. And, if you haven't been with us before, it's okay. I think you can catch up pretty quickly. This is called spiritual warfare, and as I mentioned the first week, we're kind of doing two things here. We're talking about the spiritual world, the unseen realm, and so we're going to have to spend a number of weeks just familiarizing ourselves with what that is, and that includes, or that involves, learning who's in the spiritual world, or what is in the spiritual world, maybe, and so that we're comfortable and we have a good feel for that. And then we're going to talk, and I don't know how many weeks this will be, but we're going to try to talk about how does that impact us today, and how should we respond, and how should we not maybe overreact or underreact or whatever. And to be honest with you, I'm not really sure how we're going to tackle that. I got a lot of material to help me think it through, but this first part, I'm okay with. I got this almost memorized. So, but I want to emphasize again, have us think about where do we stand in relation to the spiritual world, and where do we stand in relation to God Himself. And so I came across this quote, and I didn't attribute it to anybody, and that's a mistake. I just cut and pasted. God is not merely the greatest of all beings, as though He were somehow a species of a genus of all things in common with plants and galaxies and humans. Rather, God is utterly unique, separate from His creation. God is in a class of His own. I'm going to be talking about, God's over the spiritual world, right? And then you have these beings and so forth. We just have to remember that God is kind of above and beyond it. He's not just one of the beings. He's not just the top of the beings. He's beyond that. All right? Even though it may sound like sometimes we're just talking about Him being the top guy. There's God, and then there's everything else, and we're the everything else, okay? The spirit world and the material world. And the important thing is, you can't read that, but God has chosen to reveal Himself to His creation, and that's the pretty special part. I think it sets Christianity apart from all the other world religions. God has revealed Himself, and one way He's done that is through the Scripture, and that's why I put as much emphasis on the Scripture as I do. Try to stay out of too much speculation. Let's spend our time looking at Scripture and what we can learn. All right. Last week we ended in the middle of something very important. I've really rushed through it, and I want to try again and reemphasize this. I hope to try to clear up a little bit. And first, I need to remind us that the Old Testament itself, that was the Bible of the Christians, right? They didn't have the New Testament. The Bible, as they had it, that was a document that was written, and it was not written in English like we have it. Okay, we've got to remember that. It was written in Hebrew. Now, it was later translated for them to Greek, all right? And that was the language of the time there. And they actually used that Bible. In fact, Jesus quoted from it extensively. The Greek Bible, translated from Hebrew, called the Septuagint. But that's a side point. But the original writings that came from God to these inspired writers, it was written down in Hebrew. All right. And as I said, the New Testament was in Greek. So to better understand the Scriptures and what might be hidden in it, so to speak, what might be hiding there. We can learn a lot from looking at the original language as it was used by the Bible writers and as it was delivered to their contemporaries. They didn't write it to us, okay, as I've heard quoted many times, but it was written for us, okay? So we have to realize in their time, it was written to the people of that time, and just keep that in mind. Now, and this is where scholars, we talk about scholars, this is where they help us an awful lot. These guys spend their lives studying these Greek words and these Hebrew words and so forth, and try to help us understand when they wrote it, what the meaning was. Now, here's a case in point that we talked about last week, and I kind of rushed through it. The Hebrew word Elohim is used over 2,600 times in the Old Testament, okay? And it's used in various ways. 2,300 times, over 2,300 times, it's referring to God, the Most High, okay? It's referring to the Creator God, Jehovah, Yahweh, and so forth. You know, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Elohim created the heavens and the earth, all right? And this, so in our Bibles, you see the word God, that was Elohim or Elohim, all right? Now, about 250 times, it's not referring to him. And so it's translated a little bit, it may be translated differently. It was translated in quite a few cases. It was used when the writer was talking about lesser beings, spiritual beings, ruling spiritual beings, like in Exodus 12:12 when he refers to the gods of Egypt. Same word, Elohim, but they were talking about the gods of Egypt, and we know that because it says so. It was Elohim in Egypt. It was also used to refer to, it was translated as angels in some places. The writer were referring to angels, spirit beings up in the spiritual world, up in heaven. It was referred to as angels, and Psalm 8 and 5 is one example. It was referring to demons in one case in the Old Testament. The word demon, by the way, the word that shows up as demon is very rare in the Old Testament. You see it lots in the New Testament, but you don't see it much in the Old Testament. But in this case, Deuteronomy, it talks about demons, and then it says gods immediately, clarifying he's talking about God or gods. Both words are translated. Little G-O-D, little G-O-D-S, God and gods. The same word, Elohim, is in the... but it's clearly not referring to the Creator God, okay? Even though the same word's used. And it's even used to refer to a spirit of a human being, all right? And I mentioned that last week. This was the story about the witch of Endor. Saul went to this witch and said, I need to see Samuel. I need to talk to Samuel, who had passed away. And she brought him up through witchcraft or whatever you want to call it, the kind of stuff that's forbidden by God. She called him up, and the Bible writer says, she said, King Saul supposedly said, what do you see? What do you see? And she said, I see a God. And it was Samuel she was talking about. So the point is, the conclusion is that Elohim, just understand that word refers to God, the Creator God, in most cases, but it can refer to any being of the spirit world. I just showed you a number of them. It's not a proper name. Okay, the proper name for God is Yahweh, and that's translated, by the way, capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D in the old Bibles. When you see Lord written that way, that comes, if you go to the Hebrew, it says Yahweh. And they use that word with all caps to mean Yahweh. They didn't want to use Yahweh because it was it's revered and we shouldn't use that name. So they used Lord and they put it in all caps when they translated it for us, okay? So the context, you have to read the context to determine when you see that word Elohim, is this talking about God the Creator, or is this talking about something else? Most of the time it's God the Creator, but not always. All right. So God is Elohim, but not all Elohim are God the Creator. All right? All right. So when we see the word God in our English Bibles, it's from the Hebrew word Elohim, and it is, when we see G-O-D in our English Bibles, okay, it's from the Hebrew word Elohim, and it is referring to the Most High God. That's what our translators figured out for us. But when the scriptures are referring to gods, like gods of Egypt and so forth, they're referring to they're also starting with the word Elohim, all right? But it just means spirit beings of one type or the other. All right, I hope I've not beaten that to a pulp there, but so that's the job of translators, to do that for us. Okay. Now, that's enough of that. I'm going to jump ahead now. Remember I said, make a picture in your mind, and I said I was too lazy to do it. Okay, so I sort of did it. I said draw a circle. I use oval. It's easier. Fits on the page better. This is kind of the concept of the spirit world that the ancient Jews had, okay? And it may be the one you have too. But basically you have a spiritual world, the heavens, okay? And that's where God lives. That's also where the stars are. And, all right. And then you had the material world, and you see there's an overlap. I couldn't figure out how to show it like I wanted to. But anyway, there's an overlap there, the material world, all right? And then on the bottom, there's another spiritual world. We'll call it the underworld, all right? Sheol is the term, the Hebrew term is Sheol, all right? And we're not going to spend time talking about Sheol. That's a study in of itself. We will refer to it a number of times, okay? So, all right, so I've finally gotten to the point where I'm saying, so what? Why is this important? All right, who cares? All right, well, who cares? I do. All right. Before I leave this, though, I want to say, what's going on in the blue circle, all right? By the way, the blue circle, that's where Elohim are, all different types, right? They're up there. Okay. What's going on in the blue circle?
Quick question. Are none of them in Sheol? Or none of them considered to be?
No. Like for example, when people die, when humans die, essentially that's where they're supposed to go. And if we get into that study deeply, we can find out that God cast down those angels. They say they threw them down to the earth. They're also considered to have been cast down to Sheol, okay? And that's a word study in of itself. But some demons, or most demons, I think, are there. Our spirits are there, according to the Jews. We all go down there. But again, that's kind of a deep study in of itself. And I prefer not to spend much time there. All right, what's going on in the blue circle? All right, remember this scripture? We wrestle against the spiritual forces of evil. Remember, Paul said, in the heavenly realm. Okay, he's talking about the blue circle. That's where that goes on, in the blue circle. Paul said, we're wrestling against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms, okay? Now, I'm going to give you two examples from our Bible of things going on up there, all right? Spiritual forces battle between nations. I thought you said we're talking about spiritual. The nations are in the material world, right? Guess what? There's spiritual forces. There's battles going on in the heavens that have to do with what's going on down here. And I referenced Daniel 10, and I'm not going to spend the time. I will not finish if we go to Daniel 10 and dig into this. But if you're curious, read Daniel 10, and you'll see a description there about an angel that God sent to Daniel, okay? and to comfort him. Daniel had prayed and prayed and prayed, and finally this angel comes to him in a vision, and the angel says, I would have been here earlier, except I was held up by the prince of Persia and the prince of Greece, or the prince of Greece was about to come. But he was fighting with the prince of this country, and he was talking about the prince of another country coming, and then he said, the only one that helped me was the prince of Israel, Michael. Okay? These are interesting. These are weird things. I said it was weird when we'd be studying this. But maybe we don't understand exactly what's going on. We certainly don't. But we do get a glimpse into some things happening in heaven that were impacting things on earth. It was certainly impacting Daniel. Let me jump to another one. We're going to spend time on this one today. All right? God executes judgment in a divine assembly or a divine council or court, so forth, okay? That concept, all right? And I've referenced here Psalm 82, and we're going to read the whole thing in a minute, all right? But this is a concept that most of us, certainly I, never came across this in my entire life, at least in the way we're going to present it, that God is actually passes judgment and gets things done in a assembly of spiritual beings, all right? Now, real quickly, here's the red circle. I said we'll refer to it some, but probably a later study, all right? Yes?
Do we also see this assembly in Job?
Yes, we do, and I'll get to that. All right. Back to Psalm 82. All right. Now, I'd like to read this. In fact, if somebody feels like they can read strongly and loudly, you're welcome to read Psalm 82. It's only like 8 verses or so. Would anybody like to do that? I don't mind doing it. All right. Psalm 82.
God presides in the great assembly. He renders judgment among the gods. How long will you defend the unjust and show partiality to the wicked? Defend the weak and the fatherless. Uphold the cause of the poor and the oppressed. Rescue the weak and the needy. Deliver them from the hand of the wicked. The gods know nothing. They understand nothing. They walk about in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are shaken. I said, you are gods. You are all sons of the Most High. But you will die like mere mortals. You will fall like every other ruler. Rise up, O God, judge the earth, for all the nations are your inheritance.
Okay. Yes, ma'am?
What version?
NIV.
Thank you.
Okay. So back to Psalm 82. Here's verse 1. Okay. God, Elohim, right? God has taken his place in the divine council. This is an ESV version. In the divine council. Your word was it assembly?
The great assembly.
Great assembly. God, Elohim, has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, guess what? Elohim, he holds judgment. So if you think from a Hebrew standpoint, you're saying Elohim has taken his place, and in the middle of the Elohim, he holds judgment. All right? That's why it's important to understand this Greek, okay? Now notice that these beings, they were also referred to in verse 6 as sons of the Most High. Sons, a family reference. Okay, so these beings he's referring to, it's kind of a family kind of a thing. He's calling them sons. Sons of his, sons of the Most High. All right. And guess what? They had jobs to do, and they weren't doing their jobs. That's what this is all about. They weren't getting it done. And God said, basically, you're going to die like men. Now, divine beings are generally considered eternal, right? Like our spirit's eternal. But it doesn't have to be that way. We know that in the end, when the kingdom is given over to God, when Jesus delivers the kingdom, at the very end, we know Satan and all his spiritual beings, they're going to get thrown into the lake of fire. They're going to die. They're all going to die, all right? But we're not, all right? So this is the clearest passage, in my opinion, in the Bible that suggests that God makes some decisions, all right, using an assembly of spirit beings or a council or a court, all right? Now, this whole thing about the divine council, that's the term generally used. This has become really popular in the last 10 years, all right? And the guy behind this is a man named Michael Heiser. I told you he was one of the sources I have for this class. He's very good, all right? And I think I mentioned that, man, you know, about 85% maybe of the stuff that he brings forward I find very sound. The other 15% I find kind of murky, all right? I'm not saying he's wrong and I'm right. I'm just saying some of it I feel is very sound and scripturally based, and I find it good. Some of it, not so sure. This part, I think, is pretty sound. And like I say, this was made popular. It wasn't his original thoughts. These thoughts about the divine council and gods and so forth, it's not new, but it's not really been brought to the forefront of scholarship or whatever you want to say. All right. But let's keep going. There are other, I'll call them glimpses, because we don't get a whole lot of info in the Bible about the spiritual world, but we do get some, and it's not there for no reason, in my opinion, okay? Here's Job 1:6 and Job 2:1. In this case, it says the sons of God. Well, let's go to that. Let's just read it. We won't study it. We don't have time. All right, Job 1, verse 6. This is the story of Job, and first 5 verses talk about Job. It says, now there was a day when the sons of God, remember I said sons of the Most High before? Now it's referring to the sons of God. There was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan, or it's really more accurately, the accuser, not Satan, okay? It should have said the accuser. The accuser also came among them. The Lord said to the accuser, from where have you come? And Satan said, from going to and from the earth and so forth. And then we get this story, and you know the story, it goes on to the story of Job, all right, and how the accuser was able to afflict Job and so forth. All right, but there's a situation where the sons of God came before God, including this accuser character, all right. In Job 2:1, same thing. Again, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, before Elohim, all right? All right, so that's one glimpse of the divine council. Here's another one, 1 Kings 22. We're going to spend a little time here, and I hope I don't burn up too much of my time here, but 1 Kings 22, all right? This story, the prophet Micaiah sees Yahweh, Elohim. He sees him seated at a throne. Okay, now we're talking like a king situation or a court. I talked about an assembly or a council or a court. He sees him on a throne, and he's surrounded by the host of heavens. Go to 1 Kings 22. Is that right? All right. So this story, this is a fascinating story. And 2 weeks ago, I said if we were going to talk about this last week, and we didn't have time. So I said, y'all can read 1 Kings 22. All right, so we're going to go through it. We're going to take the shortcut through this, all right? So here's the point. I'm cutting off 15 or 16 verses here. So God is asking his assembly, he's asking him for their opinion about how do we entice Ahab. You remember Ahab? He was a bad king, and he had a very bad wife, Jezebel. All right? And he said, how do we entice him? We want to entice him to go do something that's going to end up in his death. So God basically had already set judgment. Ahab's got to go. All right? God had had enough. And so he asked his divine council, or he asked his court, he asked him, how should we do this? All right, so now we're going to, I put a question here. Have you ever read this before? All right.
We just studied it in our class 2 weeks ago on Tuesday morning.
Oh, did you? Okay. So Ahab, king of Israel, he brings Jehoshaphat from the southern kingdom. He brings him up and says, hey, will you help me go against the Syrians and get our city back, Ramoth Gilead? I think we can go take them. I think we can get this city back. And Ahab had 400 prophets, and they were all telling him, yes, yes, king is great. You can do it. Let's go do it, okay? Pardon my poor translation here, but... and Jehoshaphat said, hold on, wait a minute. Is there not another prophet that we could consult? I don't think these guys fit the pattern that Jehoshaphat was looking for in a prophet. And Ahab said, well, there's one guy, this Micaiah guy. I hate that guy because he always prophesies against me. But Jehoshaphat says, don't say that. And they bring him out, and he said, let's hear what he has to say. So this is what he had to say. Whoops. I'm going to read this one. And Micaiah said, therefore hear the word of the Lord. I saw the Lord sitting on his throne, and all the host of heaven standing beside him on his right hand and on his left hand. Okay, we're talking about the host of heaven. That's a lot of beings. That's a lot. Okay, on his right and on his left. And the Lord said, who will entice Ahab that he may go up and fall at Ramoth Gilead? And one said one thing and another said another. And then a spirit, so we're talking about spirits here. We're not talking about stars. We're talking about spirits. All right. Then a spirit came forward and stood before the Lord saying, I will entice him. And the Lord said, by what means? And he said, I will go out and be a lying spirit in the mouth of all his prophets, the 400 prophets. He said, I'll be a lying spirit. Okay. And he said, and so the Lord said, you are to entice him. You shall succeed. Go forth, go out and do so. Now, so the conclusion is, Micaiah says, now therefore the Lord has put a lying spirit in the mouth of all these your prophets. And the Lord has declared disaster for you. So Micaiah says, the reason all these guys are telling you to go do it is because this spirit is a lie. God put this lying spirit in their mouths. They're lying to you. Well, did Ahab, did he agree with that? No. Ahab ignored it, and he went to battle, and he died, okay? I'm sorry. All right. So he died in the battle, just like the Lord had already decided, but the way it happened, God got his council, his assembly. He got them involved in the decision. So that's the point of this story. So what have we learned about the heavenly spirit world from this quick run-through? All right. Well, we learned that God met with a host of spirit beings to decide what happens down here. That's kind of weird. All right, no question. And he allowed them to participate in the predetermined outcome. All right? So I don't want to say a whole lot beyond that. I mean, they didn't decide whether he was going to live or die. That was God's decision, but God allowed them to be involved. We're going to quickly run through some other glimpses of the divine counsel. All right? All right. Isaiah. The prophet Isaiah, you're familiar with this. You've heard it quoted many times from the pulpit. Isaiah's in the throne room, so to speak, or he's up in heaven, and chapter 6, and there's these seraphim beings flying around in heaven. And Isaiah's like, oh, man, he said, I don't need to be here. And he hears... he's surrounded by these seraphim, and they're saying, holy, holy, holy. And he hears God ask, whom shall I send? for us. God's talking to a group of people. Okay, I don't think he's saying for me in Isaiah. I think he's speaking for us. At least that's the implication, that this could be another one of those, we're up in the heaven area and God is talking about not just God, but others there as well. Now you could say, oh, he's talking about Jesus and the Holy Spirit. But I'm just saying this is a possible glimpse into another divine council situation. Here's one back in Daniel. This is Daniel chapter 4, and this is a story about Nebuchadnezzar and one of his visions. He didn't understand, and he asked Daniel to come interpret his vision for him. But God had issued a judgment against Nebuchadnezzar. Okay? You remember the story how he ended up turning into basically an animal and chewing grass in the field. And he lost his mind for maybe 7 years, all right? And God predicted it through this vision, and Daniel interpreted it. But the point is that when you look at this, Nebuchadnezzar was told, he saw that it was a decree of the watchers. Now the watchers is a term that's also translated holy ones, but it's definitely a spirit being, okay? There's a whole bunch of ancient writings, Jewish writings, not in the Bible, spend a lot of time talking about the watchers, but they're talking about heavenly beings, okay? And here in Daniel, there is a use of that term, the watchers, all right? Anyway, it indicates that it says that decision about Nebuchadnezzar was a decree of the watchers, but if you read the same verse, just a little ways down, it says it came from God. So it came from the watchers, but it also came from God. A collective heavenly decision. All right, so that's kind of another divine council kind of thing that went on that, again, we get a glimpse of. That's about all I can say. Psalms 89, 5 through 7. I'd like somebody to read that, those 3 verses.
Five
5
through 7.
through 7.
The heavens praise your wonders, O Lord, your faithfulness too, in the assembly of the holy ones. For who in the skies above can compare with the Lord? Who is like the Lord among heavenly beings? In the council of the holy ones, God is greatly feared. He is more awesome than all who surround him.
All right. Okay, so what's the writer said? He said, your faithfulness in the assembly of the holy ones. Sounds like the same idea. An assembly of the holy ones, okay? And he said, who in the skies, we're up there in the blue circle, who in the skies can be compared to the Lord? Who among the heavenly beings, okay? It's another term, heavenly beings, is like the Lord. A God greatly to be feared in the council of his holy ones. So again, there's the reference to that same concept. All right, so that's the last of the ones I'm going to mention here. So what do we have? Here's the spirit beings we just ran across in the divine council, in the blue circle. Okay, sons of God, the accuser, that came from Job. Host of heaven and spirit, that came from 1 Kings. Seraphim, that came from Isaiah. Gods, okay, that came from Psalm 82, thank you. Came from Psalm 82. Watchers, that came from Daniel, or holy ones. They referred to holy ones in Daniel. And of course, here in Psalm 89, we just read about holy ones again. Now, there are other spirit beings we're going to talk about before we move on. We still haven't talked about angels per se, particular. We haven't talked about archangels. There's not really a whole lot to say about them. Cherubim, there is a little bit we'll touch on about cherubim. Demons, we haven't spoken much at all about demons. This is very controversial. All right, so I'll spend a little time on these. But what I'm going to talk about demons is I'm going to say it's not that clear what demons are, okay? Some people say, oh, it's absolutely this. And I think the majority of people say, I know what demons are. But it's not clear. And then unclean spirits. That's a term used interchangeably with demons. All right, and that's from the New Testament. So now, I got to the end. So I'd like some feedback. What have I not discussed yet, or have I run past something that you feel like we need to talk about some more? And I'll probably say, oh, we're going to talk about that later. So, but is there anything troubling anybody or bothering anybody about what we've raced through? Because I know I have raced through some things, and I may have introduced new things to you. Yes, ma'am.
I just want to say that growing up in the church, I always thought that there was God, Jesus, the Holy Spirit. That was, and angels and demons. That was all.
That was everything.
That was all that I understood.
Right.
Back then. This has opened up a whole new vision that God actually had, like you said, a council, and they had decisions, and they could make decisions like we do. They had free will to make or carry out His will.
That's an excellent point. And the whole concept of a created order besides us of beings that had free will. And we see what happened to some of them who exercised their free will in a bad way. In our world, consequences of sin, we know what that is. And it has, sin has consequences. In the spirit world, it also had consequences. We know a lot about what it teaches us or tells us about Satan. Maybe not some of what's already happened, but some of what's going to happen, and a little bit about spirit beings that we'll touch on some more weird passages maybe later. Yep.
I think it's fascinating that when Moses was in the desert, his father-in-law came up with this bright idea of having men over tens and hundreds and thousands, and that's basically what God has in His divine. Is He's over, and then He's got other people, other angels or spirits over.
Yeah, she's talking about Moses was advised to put a management structure together to handle the Israelites, because he was having to deal with every problem that came up. So they put in a management structure, I'll call it. And some people say that's kind of what God did up in the spirit world. Rulers and princes and principalities and all that. That's kind of what that's referring to. And we know, at least from what we read today, that there was a bit of a structure involved in some decision making.
I think it's really awesome that God transferred that down, because the United States is built like that as well.
That's commonly the way governments and companies and people, that's how they manage things. That's right.
Well, I think that we're finding that God interacts with Satan. There's more interaction there than I ever thought.
Right. And when we get to talking about demons and so forth, we'll touch a little more on that. All right. Yes, ma'am.
I wasn't here the first two times, so you might have already mentioned this, but did you talk about the Tower of Babel and Deuteronomy 4?
Not yet.
Okay.
Not yet.
I was in your class the first time, so
Right.
I remember.
She's referring to some passages that are also Michael Heiser big deals, and I haven't gone into that. That's his worldview. He calls Deuteronomy 32 worldview. So no, we haven't gotten there. I'm sure we'll refer to it, but that's okay. Well, I know it's interesting, but just we got to keep between the ditches on this, because boy, it's easy to get off into things with speculation and things that probably not helpful. Okay, thank you everybody for coming. And if you got any questions or whatever, grab my arm and or send me an email or whatever.